How do we fool ourselves in the stock market? And what does neuroscience have to do with investment? And what does any of this have to do with Isaac Newton or the Dutch East India Company, which ran for 200 years, or Kodak, or the way that zebras like to herd, or instincts or emotions, and almost 200 different cognitive biases? Welcome to Inner Cosmos with me, David Eagleman. I'm a neuroscientist and an author at Stanford. And in these episodes, we dive deeply into our 3-pound universe to uncover some of the most surprising aspects of our lives. Today's episode asks, what do brains have to do with the stock market? So there's this old joke about a man who's looking for enlightenment, and he goes on a journey to find the wise man, and he hikes snowy mountains and fords rivers, and after many months of toil, he summits a peak and he finds the wise man sitting there cross-legged at the top. And the man drops to his knees and he says, "Oh, wise one, what profound words of wisdom can you share with me?" And the wise man looks at him and says, "Buy low, sell high." Now, whether you think that that's the world's funniest joke, it doesn't matter, because the fascinating part is that the joke has stuck around for generations. And this is because the advice is so simple, and yet most people in the stock market find it incredibly difficult for their brains to stay on track to follow that advice. Instead, they buy a stock once it's shot way up and everyone's talking about it. And when the stock starts crashing, they do a panic sell. But of course, that kind of bad decision-making is just the very start of it. We humans do all kinds of bad decision-making in the stock market, or more generally, when we're thinking about how to invest our savings. Why? Well, it's because we're not like Mr. Spock in Star Trek, who knows how to make optimal, logical decisions. Instead, we are yoked with psychologies that have long evolutionary histories. And as a result, they have all sorts of flaws in their reasoning, which we generally summarize as cognitive biases, which are these patterns that you see where we deviate from rationality in our decision-making. We do things that are often irrational. Why do we do this? Well, the world is extremely complicated, but your brain is always trying to get a grasp on it and have some control over what you can do. And so with time, like millions of years or sometimes tens of millions of years, you develop these mental shortcuts that work much of the time, but they're not actually strictly logical. Now, in my book Incognito, I wrote about how much of your brain's activity is running under the hood. And my analogy was that the conscious mind, which is the part of you that flickers to life when you wake up in the morning, that's like a broom closet in the mansion of the brain. Most of what you think and do and act and believe, you have no access to. As a result, even though we typically feel like we are excellent stewards of our decision-making, there are all kinds of irrationalities that humans display. Now, not being like Mr. Spock is typically not the end of the world, and obviously for our species, for all its flaws, we continue to get by. But these cognitive biases do show up in a much bigger way when we look at how people deal with economics. Now, traditionally, economics has been studied in the context of an ideal decision maker, often called Homo economicus. And Homo economicus is perfectly rational and not influenced by shiny objects or by what his friends are doing. But a new field began to blossom a few decades ago, and we now call that behavioral economics or neuroeconomics. And the idea is to understand how people actually make decisions and what sorts of mistakes they actually make. And I spoke about this in episode 8, which was about how your brain decides what it's actually going to buy, like which car and which restaurant you're going to go to and which ice cream flavor you're going to choose. But today I want to hit a different facet of this topic, which is you come home from work with your paycheck and you decide, I'm going to do the smart thing and invest this money, which is an important idea, but people often lose tons of money in the stock market. I've seen this happen with friends of mine, and there's been a proliferation of phone apps that let you do trading in a way that's like an addictive online gambling game, and they lose tons of money. But not everyone loses money in the stock market. In fact, academics study this and generate whole fields that win Nobel Prizes about how to allocate assets. So where's the disconnect? Well, it has to do with the brain and our psychology and with these cognitive biases. So I called up my friend, Mark Matson. Mark is an entrepreneur and deeply studies the science of investing. He's been in the financial industry his whole life, and more than anyone I know, he's seen exactly the way that humans behave and the difference in the way they would behave if they were doing so optimally. And he's just written a new book called The American Dream. And the part I want to zoom in on today is the part about how we make decisions in the stock market. So here's my conversation with Mark Matson. Okay, so Mark, one thing I talk about a lot on this podcast is this idea of the internal model, which has been building up since the day you were born. Your brain is locked in silence and darkness and trying to model the world and understand what's out there. Now, you use a term that I believe was introduced by the scholar Kenneth Burke originally that I love, which is this idea of a screen or many screens. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So most people think that they have an objective view of the world, and their view is the quote unquote right view. And what he was talking about was you don't really see the world. What you actually see is what the screens that you have allow you to see. And the screens are created linguistically from out of language. So some of these screens are created on purpose. So if you're a doctor, you spend many, many years creating all the linguistic screens around, being a doctor. But we have those screens developing all the time. And most of them aren't on purpose. They're kind of on accident. The experiences we had in life, teachers we had in life, and we are unaware that we actually have a screen, which then limits us. I mean, a lot of people talk about mindsets, but I think mindset seems like something that you can easily change. Well, I'll just change my mindset. The screen doesn't seem like a screen that you can change. It actually seems like the truth, and that locks us into the same behaviors over and over and over again.
You mean because we believe whatever our screens are telling us, we think that is the world out there. I know that to be true.
Yeah. Well, something will happen. We'll make up a story about it, a screen about it. In the book, I talk about money demons or negative beliefs around money and our relationship to money. And once they're formed, they take control. It's kind of like the movie Aliens, where the alien slams onto somebody's face, and that's all they can really deal with is the alien. It takes over. It has complete control, and we don't even realize it's happening.
So give us some examples of these money demons.
So one money demon, kind of like the underlying demon of all, is I don't have enough. I don't have enough to have a successful life. I don't have enough to create my business the way I want to. I don't have enough to live powerfully. I don't have enough to feel fulfilled. So it's this kind of a scarcity belief system, a scarcity screen that money, and it's just a screen. Money is hard to make, hard to invest, and hard to keep. So it's a screen of suffering and struggling. Another related screen would be a victimhood screen, in that I'm a victim and I can't really create what I really want to create with my life because I'm locked in from some kind of victim mentality, as opposed to an American dream screen, which would be through hard work, individualism, creativity, focusing on creating value for others. And I first became aware of this, with a story with my grandfather and my father, and they had two. In fact, the screens that they had were so extreme, it was like they weren't even living in the same world. Like it was two different dimensions. And it made it very hard for them to communicate and have a relationship throughout life.
Let's double click on that. What were those screens for your grandfather and your father?
Well, Well, so my grandfather grew up in the coal mines and the chemical factories in West Virginia. And he had a screen that actually that money was evil. And anybody that had money actually stole it and took advantage of other people. So much so that when he was actually offered a raise and to be a foreman at Union Carbide where he worked, he refused to take it because he said, I don't want to be the man and I don't want to take advantage of other people. He didn't see an opportunity to create wealth for his family, to be a foreman and actually create value for the people under him. And my dad, on the other hand, and he was driven by a question that was, why am I doomed to live in West Virginia and why am I doomed to suffer here? And my dad had a different question, which created a different screen. His question was, how can I escape this abject poverty and create wealth and prosperity for myself and other people? And he saw money as a way of creating values for others, and he believed in capitalism, and my grandfather didn't. And my grandfather died alone of emphysema from the chemical factory that he worked in. People will actually die to keep their screens.
Oh. Now, you believe that the investing industry is broken. Tell us about that.
Well, the investing industry is seriously broken because it's based on a very destructive screen. And that screen is something we call investor prediction syndrome. People believe and have been fed the idea that you need a forecast, either an economic forecast or a political forecast. And then based on that forecast, you can foresee the future and then pick all the best stocks and get in and out of the market at the right time, and or pick the best managers. But all the academic research is conclusive that all the knowable and predictable information about the future is already in the price. Therefore, only unknowable, unpredictable events will change prices going forward. And so people are gambling and speculating with their money, and they don't even realize that they're doing it. And that screen is so embedded in the financial industry that it goes unacknowledged. You turn on the TV and they're asking, well, what's going to happen with the election? And what's going to happen with inflation? And what should I invest in based on this forecast? And it begs even common sense. I mean, obviously, no one can predict the future. And if they did, they wouldn't tell you on TV. So it's crazy.
Right. And one of the things that really struck me in your book was you looked at a number of these predictions where people said in magazines or on blogs or articles or whatever about, hey, these are the stocks to pick for this year. These are the killer stocks. They're going to make you a bunch of money. And you went through, you analyzed what actually became of those as compared to, let's say, the S&P 500. And what did you find there?
Well, it's the average investor historically averages trying to do asset allocation, invest their money, earns about 2.5%, 3%. And the S&P, for example, clocks in around 10%. So on average, people are throwing away 3 to 6% of their return, trying to pick the best stocks and trying to get in and out of the market. And if you find someone that got lucky enough to beat the market, statistics show that was just luck and not skill. So it's extremely destructive for people that are trying to plan for their future and have their American dream. And it's driven by all kinds of biases, mistakes in thinking and logic. And for example, one of the biases that people have is hindsight bias. And they pick 20 or 30 stocks, and 2 or 3 of them do really well. In hindsight, they'll remember only the ones that did really well, and they'll forget about the 10 or 20 that they picked that didn't do well.
And they'll think, I'm pretty good at this.
And they'll go, wow, I'm great at picking stocks, but they never really calculated their total return. And it gives them, which leads into another bias, which is overconfidence bias. They feel way more confident in their abilities than they actually are. And we do a little game in class where we'll have people stand up. What decile do you fall in for your driving abilities? Are you in the bottom 10%, the top 10%? And if you ask them, 95% of the people think they're above average in their driving skills. So about 45% are seriously delusional. But we make the same thing with our investing ability.
Yeah, and in fact, there are many, many cognitive biases, and psychologists and neuroscientists have gone through and named and identified so many of these, almost 200 probably. But you point out several besides hindsight and overconfidence. What are others that affect the way that people invest their money?
One of the worst, most destructive is herding bias.
As in H-E-R-D.
Yeah, herding. So, great for zebra, really bad for investors. And the psychology behind it is that if everybody's doing it, it must be right, and it must be safe. And that's how bubbles happen. If you look from like 95 to 2000, S&P 5 stocks made 22% for 5 years in a row. Tech stocks made 45% 5 years in a row. So everybody loaded up on tech stocks, loaded up on, based on this herding bias. If their friends are doing it, it's almost kind of immature. I remember like high school, where peer pressure, everybody's doing it, must be the right thing to do. And then people are left, stunned when they lose. Tech stocks lost 75% of all their value. These are not inconsequential results from these biases. They can be severe.
Yeah. And one of the things that you mentioned that really struck me was this issue that no company is too big to fail.
Yeah. So another bias that people have is familiarity bias. We mistakenly think that the things that we're familiar with are safe and are good investments. So when I go around and do different speaking engagements, every town seems like it has its own, familiarity bias. In Cincinnati, where I used to live, it was Procter & Gamble. That was their home. And I had, an investor some years ago. They were only 6 months from retirement. And I said, you really should just put this in cash, wait till you retire and diversify it because you have it all in one stock. And the answer was, oh no, it's, I worked there for 35 years. I know the CEO. We're internationally diversified. And they knew the academics, which says diversify, diversify, diversify. And 6 months later, they had a $5 million portfolio. They lost $2.5 million. And just because they were familiar. I met a man recently in one of our classes with tens of millions of dollars in Boeing. And he said, no, I'm not going to diversify. I know Boeing. I worked there for 30 years. I have all my money there. And Boeing literally made an airplane that wrecked itself when the autopilot came on. And then they had doors flying off of their airplanes. And then they had violations. They had $20 billion of contracts canceled. So what I try to coach investors is, no matter how safe you think that company is, no company is safe. No company by itself is impregnable, and any of them can go bankrupt. I know it sounds ludicrous to think Apple could go bankrupt, but eventually somebody will take Apple out.
Yeah. What was the Dutch East India Company?
Yeah, so it was the Dutch East India Company. They paid an 18% dividend for 200 years, and they had their own army. They had their own warships. They had their own navy. And then in the 1700s, they just went belly up and everybody lost all their money. It was bigger than Apple, bigger than Google, bigger than Tesla. It was for its time and for all age, the largest company that ever existed.
Right. And people felt at the time, there's no possibility. They were worth in modern dollars over $1 trillion, right? Something like $7 trillion or something.
Yeah. I mean, just an incredible amount of value. And then they got killed.
Right. So if they can go out of business, Apple could go out of business, Google, any of these. Right. And
when I grew up, the big one was Kodak. And they had remember the drive up, Kodak, thing where you get your pictures developed in one day. And they even invented the digital camera. And the CEO said, no, we're not going to do that because we're a paper and chemical company. They had 95% of all the photo development. They had 85% of all the cameras sold, and they went bankrupt. Same thing with Blockbuster. Netflix for $40 million tried to get Blockbuster to buy them out, and Blockbuster said, "No, we're not going to buy you out. You know, we have 1,500 brick and mortar buildings, and that's our business model." And of course, they went under.
Whoa. Got it. Okay, so for an investor, the idea that, hey, everybody's investing in this company and it's safe, I should put my money in the Dutch East India Company or whatever, that's not a good strategy. And in fact, by the way, even very smart people can go wrong here. So Isaac Newton, what did he invest in?
So he invested in the South Sea bubble. So you got Newton, massive IQ, obviously, created discovered gravity, calculated the celestial movements, 3 dynamic laws of motion, but he got sucked in because all of his buddies were in it. Everybody was investing in the South Sea company, and he lost the equivalent of $3 million in today's dollars. And it's not just the money, it's the emotional toll that it takes on people. And he to his dying day regretted and had remorse and sadness over the fact that he had squandered so much of his wealth. And I call this attribution error. We think that because we're really good in one thing, that skill must transfer to another thing. And especially in investing, people think, well, I'm a brain surgeon, or I'm a neuroscientist, or I'm whatever. So, I'm going to automatically be good at this other thing. But I give them the example. No one would, if you those movies where the pilots of the plane get some kind of stomach problem or whatever, and they get incapacitated, and they ask for someone to come and fly the plane, and then a passenger lands the plane. I looked up the statistics. That has never happened, not one single time. And if you ask pilots, what are the odds of that happening? They are 0. There is no chance of a person that's not trained to land it. But if you ask men, could they do it? 50% of all men say they could land that plane. 50%.
Yeah. Yeah.
Overconfidence and attribution error.
And what about the necessary lie bias?
Oh my gosh. This one has massive application, not only to investing. So it's the thing that you do before you do something that's imprudent. It's a lie that you tell yourself to allow you to do it, even though you know you shouldn't. So it's like, okay, for an alcoholic, well, just one won't hurt. One drink won't hurt. Or for a gambler, and they're in Vegas, well, they're down $20,000, but I'll stop when I get even. Or in fitness area, I really want to lose 30 pounds, but that pizza looks really good. I'll start my diet tomorrow. So it allows a person to take an imprudent behavior and justify it with a lie and get away with it.
Oh, boy. And so we're yoked with all these biases. They steer our behavior. Even though we tend to think we're like Mr. Spock in Star Trek, we're not at all. And every bias comes with a story, right?
Yeah, it all comes with the story. It's interesting to watch people. One of the stories people have, and it is the perception that they're in control of their thinking. And this is one of the exercises in the workshop I write about in the book, that we really don't have as much control as we think we do. And I got a lot of this from your book, Incognito. But for investors, they really feel like they have control. And we do a couple exercises. One is, for 30 seconds, close your eyes and don't think of anything. No self-talk, and if people are honest at the end of the 30 seconds, almost everybody has to raise their hand that, their internal voice came back. So I said, well, if you can't control, you can't even stop it, you're definitely not in control of that inner voice. And then it also shows up. It doesn't show up like a cheerleader when you wake up in the morning. Like, I'm going to take on the day. I'm going to create unbelievable things. It's more like Eeyore. Oh no, another day, and I should work out, but it's raining. I think I'll have a donut. And so, and then we talk to ourselves, and that's a bizarre thing in itself. We debate ourselves and talk to ourselves. Who's the person doing the talking, and who's the person doing the listening? And so people, they feel like they have all this control over their behavior and actions in investing. And the reality is they just don't.
Okay, so we talked about some biases, but even really basic stuff like how an investor understands what is meant by their average return. What's an example of the way that gets manipulated?
First of all, most investors have no idea what they've actually earned or didn't earn over the last 30 years. The best way to calculate a rate of return is time-weighted and dollar-weighted compound return. And I don't expect anyone to understand any of that. But what I will say is that it's very easy to misunderstand your rate of return. So let's say you have an investment, because most people calculate their average rate of return. So let's say you start with 100,000 and you get 100% in 1 year, and it goes up to 200,000. And then the next year you lose 50% and it goes back down to 100,000. Well, the average rate of return is 25% because you got 100 minus 50, which leaves you 50 divided by 2, which is 25%. But your real rate of return is 0. And investors try to calculate their average rate of return, but it's widely inaccurate. And so that just leads to the overconfidence bias and all the other biases as well. But in addition to the biases, investors also have to deal with their instincts. And the instincts are, in life, a lot of times they give you great signals. Like if I'm out in the water and someone yells shark and my instinct is to go in, that's, probably not a bad instinct. But they're driven by pleasure and pain. So some things are pleasurable, like maybe I like chocolate covered peanuts. And if I have a small little handful, fine. But if I eat a whole half pound bag of peanuts, bad news. Chocolate covered peanuts, I'm going to get fat, I'm going to cholesterol, I'm going to, die eventually. Same thing with pain. A lot of people will say exercise is painful, and maybe for some people it is. But it could also save your life. Well, investing instincts are almost always wrong. When you lose 30% in your equities, that's pain, and people want to leave, they want to run, they sell it, they go to whatever's high, and they're always doing the exact opposite of what they should do. They're chasing high returns, they're panicking when things go down, and so the instincts are deadly for investors, and they run in the background and they don't even realize it's happening.
So what did you learn from the academics about investing?
The first thing I learned from the academics, and the only reason I was willing to accept what they had to say, was that I had done the speculating and gambling. I actually was part of the problem. I was with a broker dealer. They were telling me try to pick the best stocks. They were telling me they could time the market and get in and out. They were telling me they had these great managers that could beat the market. And I was investing my money that way, my family's money, my clients' money, and it wasn't working. And I went to the broker dealer and I said, hey, this is broken. People are getting hurt. And the president of the broker dealer said, so what? Just sell them something else. What's your problem? So I heard a debate between Donald Yachman of 5-Star Money Management and Rex Sinkfeld, who had studied under Eugene Fama at the University of Chicago, who's now a Nobel Prize winner. And they taught me about efficient market theory. And efficient market theory means that the returns don't come from great managers. The returns come from asset classes or categories based on the cost of capital, which means a company that is more risk long-term should have a higher return because they have a higher cost of raising capital to fund their company. And so if you look historically, things like large stocks historically around 10%, small stocks historically 12%, small value stocks 14%. So the return comes from the market, not the manager. So the first job is to eliminate gambling and then focus on the academics to develop a portfolio with the highest expected return and the lowest amount of volatility. And David, I've been teaching financial advisors about this for 34 years, and they still don't get it. And it's a sad thing, and it's tragic because a lot of people say they do it, but then their own biases, the advisor's biases, and their instincts and their emotions take over, and it destroys the process.
Oh, so what are the lessons that come out of you look at all the stuff, the Nobel laureates in economics and the things they discover and lessons they learn? How do you summarize all that?
The first thing is, most people, the way they relate to their money, especially their portfolios, is through speculating and gambling, and they don't really mind because they don't really have a purpose for their money that they've acknowledged and they focus on. So in the lack of focusing on a purpose, the default position is just getting more money. Now, the problem with just getting more money is that just getting more money can't make you happy. As a matter of fact, as a practitioner working with thousands of people, actually getting more money can have the opposite effect. It creates more doubt, more fear, more responsibility, jealousy within the family, more stress and anxiety about how you're going to invest it or what you're going to do with it. So more money does not make you happy. And you can think about people like Howard Hughes and Elvis Presley and Marilyn Monroe. Obviously, money, power, and fame doesn't equal happiness. And the reason it doesn't is because you might get that temporary thrill from that new car or that piece of jewelry or that new house, but it's temporary in nature and is not lasting. But that's what keeps people gambling with their money, because they figure if they can take their $1 million and turn it into $2 million, they'll all of a sudden be happy. Well, it's not true. And I discovered that when I was 27 working with investors. So I spend my whole life trying to help people build their money, and then the net result is no happiness. I was like, wow, this is terrible. So so one of the things we do is we help people break through the no talk rule, because people have terrible shame and guilt about money also. And they often learn the no talk rule about it from their parents.
Tell us what the no talk rule is.
Yeah. So the no talk rule is that, and usually in families, there's a no talk rule about the no talk rule. So you know, the next door neighbor gets a new car, and Johnny says to mom, well, I wonder how much that car cost. I'm going to go ask them. And they're like, don't you do that. Don't you dare ask somebody what their car cost. You know, that's impolite. That's rude. We don't talk about stuff like that. And so normally, if you look at things that people don't talk about, it's usually because they feel shame and guilt around it. And so then there's the stigma about talking about money, and it's very destructive. And people are taught that if you're going to invest, you do it alone, either isolated by yourself on a computer or maybe just with one other advisor. It's never, ever thought of maybe we should do this as a community, have a class and training and workshop, and people could talk about their life and their money and their experience, which I found is actually the most powerful way. So without a lack of purpose, then people are thrown to investing, picking, timing. And then today you have all these toxic investments like Bitcoin that people get sucked into gambling with. And in a lot of areas of life, you can make a single mistake. If you've lost 40 pounds and you go have a piece of cheesecake at dinner, okay, fine. You're probably not going to have a heart attack that night. That's not how investing works. You can make one mistake on any one given day, and you can wipe out 45 years of hard work and investing. And that's what makes all these biases so critical. And if the instincts and the biases weren't enough, then you also have to deal with emotion. So you have this cocktail of emotions, instincts, and biases whipsawing you all over the place as an investor with no academic understanding of how markets really work. And you can see how it can be so dangerous for people.
Excellent. By the way, I think I want to step back on one point, though. What were the 5 discoveries that you were able to summarize out of all this?
Yeah, so discovery number 1, stock picking in all of its forms is destructive behavior. Now, when I coach people on this stuff, they have a massive amount of cognitive dissonance because they've been doing it for 20 or 30 years. So when they first hear it's jarring. So stock picking in all of its forms is destructive behavior. Market timing, trying to get in and out of the market at the best timing. That's destructive behavior. It actually increases risk and variance in a portfolio. Track record investing, trying to find the manager that beat the market in the past with the hopes that they'll continue to do it in the future. Destructive behavior. For most experienced investors that have been around for a while, I have done one or more of these behaviors in the past, and left to my own devices will repeat them without a disciplined coach to help me through it. And then finally, the coup de grace, I always tell people, if you can get this one, you automatically get the other ones. It is abjectly absurd to speculate and gamble with my money, especially once I've created a purpose that's greater than money itself. And those are the 5 discoveries from the academic research that I've been able to work with these researchers over the last 34 years.
You had talked about this thing where you ask people to pick 3 stocks that they want to invest in.
Yeah.
So tell us about that.
So in the class, I was trying to think of a way, because you go through these biases and we have exercises and we take people through the biases and the emotions and the instincts and the whole thing. Say familiarity bias, size bias, hindsight bias, herding bias. And I was trying to think, how can I have an example of this working? So I have people write down 3 stocks. And then I have them stand up and I read off the 5 biggest stocks. Amazon, Tesla, Meta, Facebook, NVIDIA. And when I'm done reading off the list of the biggest 5, 95% of the people are standing. And I said, guys, I just went over, there are over 20,000 stocks in the US market you could buy. 20,000? And you guys still picked the top only 5? And I tell them it's because you didn't pick the stocks. The stocks picked you. Through your screens and your biases, all you could see, even though I spent a day and a half teaching you about this stuff, you still picked the biggest ones you're the most familiar with that are hurting, and everybody else is doing the exact same thing.
Right. But now, why is that a problem? Because you might say, look, what's the problem with hurting if I go for this big stock?
Yeah, the problem is you're not diversified. And when we analyze portfolios, I call them Frankenstein portfolios. They might have an index fund here and there. Then they have some active managers. And then they're loaded up on those top 5 stocks. And the problem is, since we discussed that, number 1, any company can fail. I remember 2008 to 2009, trillions of dollars disappeared in companies like Enron, WorldCom. Everybody had all their money in those big companies. They thought they were bulletproof. Even GM went bankrupt in 2008 and 2009. So, the problem is you have massive amounts of risk without any expected additional return. Versus for that part of your portfolio, maybe you're going to put 15% in large companies. You could just own the S&P 500 and own all 500. Not, playing Russian roulette by picking out just 5. And so the damage is, like Newton, and showing this. Newton thought he had it figured out too. He was stock picking. He was market timing. He was track record investing. And I don't think anybody in my class is smarter than Newton.
But it's more than that, isn't it? Because the return on those big stocks is much less than the return on other stocks in the market as well, right? In other words, once you know, hey, everyone's talking about X and you buy it, then it's too late already.
Yeah, if you look at, let's say that you loaded up on 7, they call it the Magnificent 7, and you're referring to a graph in the book. It says, well, okay, these Magnificent 7, in hindsight, which you can't go back in a time machine and buy now, in hindsight, they made 22% higher return than the market, hypothetically, over the last 3 years. So everybody is, based on recency bias, another one we didn't talk about yet, based on the recent performance just over the last 3 years, everybody extrapolates that out and says, oh, they're going to continue to beat the market the way they have over the last 3 years. But the graph in the book shows that on average over the next 10 years, those stocks that got hot underperformed the market dramatically over the next 10 years. So that 3-year, you can't go back in a time machine and buy those 3 years. And if you chase those returns, chances are you'll dramatically underperform the market.
So tell us about the importance of decision control systems.
We talk about algorithms, and you can have an algorithm of how to take all this academic information and build portfolios. And that's absolutely required. And in addition to that, most people don't think of algorithms as something that control human behavior. But if you only have one piece of the pie, you could have a great engineered portfolio, just like you could have a great engineered diet, or you could have a great engineered workout program. But if you don't have the decision control system that then helps you stay committed to that process and discipline over long periods of time, it'll fail every single time. So you have to have a way to manage your own behavior, because investing is so easy to destroy the behavior. Even if I gave you the perfect mix of the portfolio and you went online, you bought the mix of the assets, right next to that perfect portfolio is a button that you can click on your cell phone to sell it and destroy it, or add garbage to it like Bitcoin or gold or some exotic new thing that comes out. So it is critical to have a decision control system to manage and control for human behavior. And without that, I've discovered over the last 40 years, the process almost always fails.
So what is your decision control system?
So first of all, I have to, my wife reminds me it's not always easy for me. I have to be humble. And I have to recognize what I can do and what I can't do, and not live in a fantasy world where I think I can predict the future. So I have to have people like Eugene Fama and Nobel Prize winner, and Harry Markowitz, people like you that remind me that I'm limited in my human behavior and that my instincts and emotions could take over unless I protect against it. So I defer to the academics, and I defer to scientific proof. And then I have to stay disciplined no matter what. 2008, 2009, the S&P dropped 50%. And investors were begging, sell, 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 get me out, get me out. It would be easy to cave in for a money manager. Saw many that did it, to cave into what the investor wanted at the time. But we get paid to keep people disciplined, not to cave into their instincts, emotions, and biases. Staying true to that, and then for the investor and the advisors, you have to create education, workshops, exercises, and constant reinforcement. Without that constant reinforcement and repetition over and over and over again, people will fail at the exact wrong time when the stress and anxiety are the highest. So it's a whole process that people need to follow if they're going to have any hopes of staying disciplined over a 30-year period, which is what it takes to be an investor.
That was Mark Matson, who runs Matson Money and has a new book out called The American Dream. Now, I just want to pick up one point he made about having a decision control system. In other words, some way to bind your decision-making. There are many ways to do this. My favorite is the Ulisses Contract, which I covered in episode 9. So very briefly, you may remember the story in the Odyssey. The Greek legend, the hero of the Trojan War, Ulysses, is returning home after the war's end when he realizes that his ship is going to pass the island of the Sirens. And this presents a wild opportunity because the Sirens are known for their mesmerizingly beautiful songs. But these songs are so enchanting that they hypnotize any sailors who hear them, which causes the sailors to steer their ships towards the island, and they inevitably crash into the rocks and die. And Ulysses knew that he, like any other mortal, would be powerless against the siren's song, and he was going to meet the same fate if he heard those songs. But he really wanted to hear the songs, so he devised a plan. He ordered his men to tie him to the mast of the ship with ropes, and he told them, no matter how much I scream or beg or cry, just keep rowing. Whatever I do, just keep rowing. And then he had his men fill their ears with beeswax to block out the siren's song. So he did this while they were still far from the island, and this was a rational move because he knew that the future Ulysses, once they were close to the island, would be impulsive and would be unable to resist his short-term desires. And so understanding this danger, the rational Ulysses at a distance set up safeguards to prevent his future self from making a fatal mistake. This was a contract between his present self and his future self. His present self who was rational and his future self who was crazed with desire. He thought clearly about how he was going to act in that future scenario, and he created barriers to protect himself from his own behavior. So this type of decision where we willingly create constraints to bind our future actions, that's what's known as a Ulisses Contract. It's a pre-commitment strategy where you do something now to bind yourself to some course of action that you know is a good move, but you know that your future self isn't going to want to do. So in investing, you can set up Ulisses contracts with yourself to prevent emotional decision-making that leads to lousy outcomes. There are lots of ways people do this in investing. A simple one is automated investments. You set up automatic contributions to your investment account and automatic buys of, say, an index fund like the S&P 500. And then you just sit back and know that this is running in the background. This way, you don't need to be involved with your ongoing biased decision-making, and this avoids the temptation to skip contributions when markets are volatile or when you feel the itch to spend your money elsewhere. You can also set up predefined rules for selling investments. You can set up orders that sell a stock if it drops to a certain price or hits some predetermined gain, and that prevents the temptation to hold on to investments too long or selling too soon. This is not an investing podcast, so I'm not going to go into detail on any of this, but you can make diversification commitments and then make sure you stick to that allocation as a Ulisses contract. And that prevents you from overly concentrating in one asset. And depending on your circumstances, you can even build barriers to accessing your investment accounts easily. Some people will use financial advisors or a separate investment platform that requires a lot of effort to make changes. And this is something on the opposite end of the spectrum from these apps that make it effortless to buy and sell stocks like you're playing a video game. Anyway, whatever you put into place, the simple idea behind a Ulisses contract is to create systems that prevent bad decision-making or emotional decisions or impulsive decisions. And that's probably the smartest thing we can do. Keep our moment-to-moment psychology out of these sorts of decisions. So that's the main takeaway lesson from today. From the point of view of neuroeconomics, no matter how smart you are in other areas, there are many influences under the hood that badly bias your decision-making. So go out and have fun and do whatever you want, but figure out what you need to do to avoid the siren's song so that you can have smooth sailing into the future. Thanks for joining me on this journey into our minds. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe. Go to eagleman.com/podcast for more information and to find further reading. And check out and subscribe to Inner Cosmos on YouTube for videos of each episode and to leave comments. Until next time, stay curious. I'm David Eagleman, and we have been sailing through the inner cosmos.